Well, this is going to be fun visiting Philly Pressbox Radio to talk about his terrific new book and more. A gentleman who spent more than 40 years at NFL Films. It's Bob Angelo. Hey, Bob, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing just great. Before we talk about your career at NFL Films and this new book, which I thoroughly enjoyed, NFL Off Camera, is it true that you were a high school quarterback in Western Pennsylvania?
I was tiny, non-existent now, Neville High School, which became part of the Cornell school system. 29 people in my graduating class.
Whoa.
And so every guy had to do something. And so I signed up early. I was a 13-year-old backup quarterback as a freshman. And then by my sophomore year, I inherited the job toward the end of the season and played my last 2 years. And I think we won a total of 5 games my junior year and only about 2 my senior year. We were starting to get outclassed by the larger school districts that had more young men to choose from.
Of course. And you were a Steelers fan before they were a great team. Is that right?
They stunk. I mean, I watched Pittsburgh. Oh, gosh. They played for one postseason berth in 1963, lost the game to the New York Giants, as I recall, in Yankee Stadium, I believe. And that was it. The rest of the decade was abysmal. And even under this new coach named Chuck Noll, they were still abysmal. They were 1-13 first season, but they had a guy named Joe Green on the roster who was fun to watch. And then the next year they got Bradshaw, and then the rest is history.
Is it true that while you were at Penn State, you pretty much badgered Steve Sable for a job at NFL Films?
I did. My senior year, I said to myself, what do you like doing? I said, I love watching pro football and talking about pro football and analyzing pro football and writing about pro football. So I picked a name off the credits one day as I was watching an NFL Films production. It was Steve Sable. And I wrote him my first letter. I went to graduate school at Northwestern studying broadcast journalism. And by the time I was ready to graduate there, I'd written Steve a dozen letters. And I remember the first paragraph of the very last one that I wrote. I tailored it to a Philadelphia audience, and I wrote, Dear Mr. Sable, Mike Schmidt will hit tape measure shots, Bernie Perrant will make kick saves, and someday I will work for NFL Films, period. He liked that. He really liked that. And by then, he'd accumulated a deep file of things from me. He realized this guy really wants to work here. I sent him scripts of radio shows that I did at both Penn State and Northwestern about pro football. Each show was called Pro Football Report. Sunday night after games, I'd rip and read wire service copy that I edited to make it sound more like me. And then I'd offer some commentary on the sport. And basically, he said, we're looking for writers. I can teach people how to make films. But if someone can write, then someone can be a producer. Someone can learn to write. And had me in for an interview June 6th, 1975. It was a Friday. I went to a Phillies game that night with former college roommates and friends. But at 1:35 p.m. on June 6th, 1975, Mr. Sable, Ed Sable, hired me. And not that I remember. And that changed my life. And I spent the next 43 plus years working for the Sables and NFL Films and the National Football League.
Yeah, 43 years, and you shot and edited more than 850 games before retiring in 2018. Your last game happened to be the Eagles knocking off those Patriots in Super Bowl 52. You won 21 Emmy Awards. Now, rather than ask you about your legacy at NFL Films and the decision to write this great book, I'm going to let a friend of yours handle that.
All right. He was part of the company really when it started with Ed Sable and Steve Sable, when it was just, the whole company was like 8 people. So you had to do everything. And Bob did. And he became one of the real stalwarts of that company. And he had told me, he called me a couple of years ago, and he said, I have all of these experiences and all of these memories, 40 years of doing this. I'd like to write a book. Do you think, you think that would work? I said, Bob, I think it's a great idea. One of the things that happens, and I've worked at NFL Films long enough that I experienced this. If you'd be in a hotel lobby or in an airport, which we were constantly because we're traveling, and you're wearing NFL Films gear and you're carrying NFL Films cases, so people know who you are. People come up to you all the time and say, God, what's it like to be on the sidelines at an NFL game? What's it like to be on the sidelines at a Super Bowl. People want to know these things, you know. That's kind of what Bob's book's about.
Ray wrote the foreword for your book, and he speaks very highly of you, Bob.
Well, I saw Ray last night. I went to Westchester and to see Tommy and me. Took a friend, saw Ray eating at the same restaurant we'd chosen for dinner, and we talked a bit. Enjoyed the play immensely. Sent him an email this morning just telling him how beautifully staged it was, and of course how well written it was. And I was flattered when I asked Ray if he would write the foreword. He said, absolutely. I mean, I always thought that we had a good working relationship, and I always respected him. And I think that had a lot to do, of course, with Temple University Press picking up the book.
Mm-hmm.
Good enough for Ray, good enough for us. So always indebted to Mr. Didinger, and also like him very much. He's just a great person. On camera, off camera, same guy.
Yeah, he's a friend of our show. He's been on, I think, 22 times over the last 9 years, not that I'm counting. Just a terrific guy. And as I said, he wrote the foreword. And what I like about this book, in addition to the many, many great stories, is that every chapter is just 2 or 3 or 4 pages in length. It's a true bathroom book, is it not, Bob?
Well, I said that on Good Morning Football last week. I said, I told my wife, I'm writing a toilet book, I said. And she said, no, it's not a toilet book. It's a coffee table book. It's a collection of short stories that can be read quickly. And that was a choice. I said, football fans consume their football in large doses, 3 to 3.5 hours to watch their favorite team. God knows how many hours on their fantasy football lineups and rosters and transactions and all of that. So the last thing they need is another long narrative. I said, I'm going to write these stories, no more than 1,200 words each, so that football fans can take it down the hall to the bathroom during a television timeout and come back knowing something completely new about Jim Taylor or Otto Graham or Andy Reid or, any one of 110 story subjects in the book. My wife, who is a pretty good judge of good writing, didn't like any of the screenplays I wrote, didn't like any of the ideas I'd ever come up with. And then she read 1 or 2 of these stories that I handed to her, and she said, I think you're onto something here. And that's when I knew I was onto something, because I was. I kind of had a feeling about these stories because they're quick, they're pithy, they're substantive, and they're personal. Every single story in my book has a personal experience with the player or the coach or the front office person or the owner or the media person that I was writing about. Short stories. I call my table of contents the random access table of contents. Pick one that you like, read it, put the book down, come back to it later. You don't have to read from A to Z, even though it's called the A to Z Guide.
Yeah, my kind of book. Let me hit you with a few names with connections to Philly, Bob, and give me 30 seconds or so on each. How about Eagles and Vikings wide receiver Chris Carter?
Chris became one of my real good NFL friends. I had a few in my career, people who were more than just players to me, and Chris was one of them because of his candor, his honesty, the fact that he could take a good hard look at himself and say, I'm messing my life up here. I've got to change things. I interviewed him. I did the long interview for his Football Life episode and had him in the chair for about 4 hours. And I asked him point blank about his addictions and his issues. And his wife was standing nearby in the kitchen, large home. Still, she could hear everything he said. And he was so brutally honest about himself and about his shortcomings. Hard not to admire that, especially after he became the 3rd receiver to catch 1,000 balls. And we had him wired that night. He looked out, looked at me and said, stay right there, Bob. It's coming your way, coming right at you. And sure enough, it did.
Oh, I love that. One of my favorites, the Hall of Fame coach, Dick Vermeil.
Man, Dick worked his teams hard, and that's putting it lightly. Eagles came into games, I don't want to say exhausted, but ready, sometimes too ready, as in that first Super Bowl against the Raiders. Yeah. I think they were a little worn out from the alleged two-a-days. I wasn't there. I didn't see it happen, but I'd heard that Dick took them back to training camp. figuratively. And I'm thinking, why would you do that? You've got a veteran team here. You've got a veteran quarterback. But I admired Dick again for his honesty, his candor, and his raw emotion. Dick could be brought to tears instantly over lots of different things, but he felt so deeply for his cause, for his players, for everything that he was involved in. It was hard not to feel that. And I'm sure a lot of his players said, yeah, we buy in because our coach is with us. He's one of us. He cares about us as human beings. He may work the hell out of us, but at the same time, he knows who we are and respects us, cares.
And still going strong at age 86, I believe. The great broadcaster, Harry Callis.
Harry Callis afforded me opportunities that I never would have had I not known him. First off, loved working with him. Secondly, after every football season, he would take one of his weekly checks from NFL Films and fund this elaborate party that became an NFL Films institution known simply as Harry's Party. And every year, right after the season, right when we needed it the most, we would go out there, get hammered, eat, drink, talk about the season, reminisce, shake hands, hug, do all that stuff, get rides home. We even then we realized, no, way too loaded to be behind the wheel of a car. But the third thing was I wanted to get into live direction. And I always had baseball as my favorite sport. I wanted to be a Major League Baseball player. Grew up listening to Bob Prince announce Pittsburgh Pirate games and thought to myself, I think I could do this. I asked Harry for a little help. Not only did he give me the names of the people who one of Philadelphia's television broadcast team crews in the truck, but he called them and said, give this guy a chance to come in and watch. And I went there and I studied under one of the Phillies directors. His name is escaping me right now, and watched how he did business. And I thought, oh boy,
RJ Aquila or something like that.
There you go, RJ and JR.
Yes, I was close.
And I watched him, and I spent 2 nights there. I went back the second night just to make sure that the calm that I saw the first night was real. And then I actually had a chance to do it. I directed a College World Series. They're called the Super Regionals. And I did the University of Miami, who had a freshman shortstop named Ryan Braun at the time, versus North Carolina State. And I did 2 games, and I literally didn't sleep the night before. I was, when the assistant director said 30 seconds to air, I looked around and said, who's he talking to? And then I realized it was me. And so I pushed my way through that. But it gave me a taste of what live television direction is like. And it kind of reminded me that no, stick to being a segment producer. You're doing fine with that, and a producer and someone who can direct in a truck live to tape. And but Harry afforded me those opportunities. Another great guy. I'm talking too long here. You said 30 seconds, but another great person and somebody I always enjoyed being around.
We can't talk about NFL Films without talking about the late, great John Facenda, another Philadelphia legend, by the way. Here's a little bit of the voice of God.
The game is a time warp where the young dream of growing up and the old remember youth. And for a few hours on Sunday, neither fantasy nor reminiscence seems foolish.
Tell me about working with John Facenda.
John inspired a generation of football fans. When people ask me what made NFL Films, was it the cinematography? Was it the music? Was it something else? I said it was something else. John Facenda's voice, I think, early on is what made NFL Films hypnotic and compelling. I know in high school, when I was a freshman quarterback at Neville High School, our coach had a bootleg 16 millimeter film that he played for us. And I heard John's voice for the first time. And I think the line went something like, there are many superstars in pro football, but only one Superman. And the editing settled on a shot of Deacon Jones. And I was ready to go. Let's practice now. Let's put on the pads and go out and play and do this. John just could do that. He could make a shopping list interesting. Broccoli, Brussels sprouts, peppermint patties. He was just, and the first time I worked with him, all the senior producers reminded me, do not go in there with dirty copy. He hates scratch outs and penciled in corrections, and do not overwrite for him. He has one pace. It's slow. Well, I ignored everything. I went in there and did what I thought was best. And at the end of it, he said, Bobby, if we're going to work together, you have to do a few things differently. First off, don't be handing me this scratched out stuff. And number two, you need to write less. And that was good advice, writing less, because, writing for the ear, you don't want to fill people up with too many words all the time. And that's how it turned out. That's how it went. And we worked together well for the next 7 years until John unfortunately passed away.
And you wrote this line for him.
There are 27 teams in pro football. And then there are the Pittsburgh Steelers.
I watched that whole episode. That was a great one. The 79 Steelers.
Oh, yeah. I get goosebumps just watching that, because I conceived of that opening about mid-season, thinking that the Steelers were going to go to their 4th Super Bowl in 6 years. And I shot those tunnel shots, every one of those things. And I got that very first shot that you showed of them coming out of the locker room, starting down the tunnel on the last game at Three River Stadium that season. So that's how up against the wall I was with that. And I knew that if I could get the shots with that music, John would sell it. And then, of course, I needed the Steelers to win the Super Bowl. And they did.
Yep. Okay, we have to, of course, talk about the creation of Hard Knocks, because you had a prominent role in that. How did that come about in 2001? And you got to tell me the Brian Billick story, too.
Brian was tremendous. I knew Brian from his days as the offensive coordinator in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. Steve Sable called me into his office one day. He didn't give me all the details. He said, someone came up with this idea and you're going to do it. The idea apparently came from a Hollywood producer named Marty Callner, who's always credited in every Hard Knocks episode ever. But Steve said, it's your show. Develop it the way you want. Do it the way you want. And it's the Baltimore Ravens. And wow, really? And then I realized, oh, this is going to be great, because, Brian's going to let me do whatever I want to do. And pretty much they did. I mean, the Ravens gave us total access. I mean, that's the first I ever heard that term. Now it's the name of a very popular television show on the net. But we got total access. The Ravens basically didn't stop us from doing anything except coming in to the training room when there were players with medical issues. They didn't want that out there for contractual reasons. I understood. And every Wednesday morning after the show was edited and ready for air, I had to screen it for the Modells, for Brian Billick, for the media relations executives, and Ozzie Newsome. And it was Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. early, so that if there were any changes, they could be made at NFL Films before the air date on Wednesday night, before the airtime on Wednesday night. The first week, no one said a word. They just got up and left, and everyone said, good job. However, Steve Sable was very concerned about all the profanity. I said, Steve, this is football camp, professional football camp. You know what goes down here, He was still concerned. So prior to the second show, he instructed all the editors to avoid profanity where possible, and where profanity had to be part of the show, bleep it or use presents to get rid of it. Well, that second Wednesday morning, when I screened the show for the Ravens, Brian was the last to leave. I could tell he had something on his mind. And he got up and he said, Bob, great show again, but we need a few more gratuitous F words in there. Could you see to that? And he walked out. I got on my cell phone. I called Steve. From that moment on, the gates were open and people got a glimpse of what training camp really sounds like. Great.
And still going strong all these years later, Hard Knocks. Hey, we're pretty much out of time, but I'm not going to get you to try to tell either of these stories, but folks, if you buy this book, make sure you read the chapters on Matt Kavanaugh and Connor Barwin, because I literally laughed out loud reading both of those. You know what I'm talking about.
Connor was a trip. He knew exactly what he was doing. He set me up. Oh, man. And when he said it, I felt like flipping him off, but I thought, I'm on the sideline. I can't do that. But it was so funny. It was hilarious. And then
And the little stinky story involving Matt Kavanaugh, that was a blast too. But folks, read it in the book. It is the NFL Off Camera, an A to Z guide to the league's most memorable players and personalities. I just loved it. Bob, thanks so much for doing this. I hope we can talk again sometime.
anytime, I'm here. I'm retired. I basically promote the book. That's what I do. That's my life these days. So anytime, this was a lot of fun.